And if evil doesn't come from the forest, but from the house itself, what if the killer you're looking for is already dwelling among the bodies? It sounds like a script from a horror movie, one of those that make you lock the door twice before going to sleep. But this story is real, totally real. There are no monsters created by screenwriters. There are no ghosts pixelated by special effects. Just a family, a secluded place. It's a crime, which was never resolved. In the archives of European criminal history, few cases managed to cause as much discomfort as the Hinterkaifeck massacre, one of the most disturbing unsolved murders ever recorded, and perhaps the closest the world has ever come to a truly supernatural crime. In March 1922, in the icy heart of the Bavarian countryside, an entire family disappeared. No noise, no witnesses, no sign of escape. Neighbors noticed the silence. The children did not show up at school. The milk was left at the door without being collected, and the smoke from the chimney continued, day after day after day. When they finally decided to investigate, what they found was something that would mark them for the rest of their lives. 6 bodies, stacked in the barn, covered by hay, massacred with blows. And worst of all, someone was living there, with them, after the crime. Yes, someone slept among the mortos. Cozy warmed in the fireplace. He ate the family's food. He wore the clothes. He turned the calendar to the next day. The killer did not flee. He settled in. This is not an urban legend. This is not creepypasta. This is not conspiracy theory to feed Reddit forum. And no one, absolutely no one, was arrested. This is the essence of true horror cases, when the horror does not come from the imagination, but of reality. A place where unsolved mysteries, true crimes with paranormal traits, and unexplained facts intersect, and you begin to doubt everything you believe. Do you believe in hauntings? Maybe. This story will change your answer, because the accounts of this family before the massacre are disturbing. Mysterious footprints from the forest, but none going away. Sounds in the attic, as if someone was walking upstairs, even when the house was locked. Objects changing places. A key that disappeared days before the murders, and witnesses who swear they saw shadowy figures watching the house, at a distance, for hours. For weeks, the family lived with the feeling that they were being watched. And perhaps, in that place forgotten by civilization, they were not alone. But what makes this case even more terrifying is what happened next. After the deaths, after the discovery. The police, unprepared, allowed neighbors and onlookers to roam freely around the crime scene. Evidence was destroyed. The murder weapon was only found a year later, hidden in the attic. And the bodies had their heads removed and sent to a medium. Yes, you heard that right. Not even the investigation escaped the darkness. 100 years later, there are no answers. The only certainty is fear. The fear of knowing that someone, or something, he lived there, surrounded by corpses. And the most unsettling, some clues to this crime were literally buried. And the theory you're going to hear here today, maybe it will change everything. If you have the courage. The real story of the Hinterkaifeck massacre begins now. Hinterkaifeck, a name that, today, carries an almost ritual weight. But back then, it was just a farm, a piece of land in the middle of nowhere, far from everything, surrounded by silence and trees that never seemed to end. On the map of Germany, he could barely see himself. But what happened there echoes to this day as one of the most brutal, unsolved real mysteries in modern criminal history. The property was simple, functional. Like so many others at the beginning of the century, the structure had a main house, a connected barn, sheds, and a noisy engine that kept the farming routine turning. But what was rural, it was also sinister, because there was something strange there, something that cannot be explained with words alone. Those who passed by the road that crossed the muddy trails of Kaifeck almost always looked away, as if the place itself repelled curious people, as if he knew what was coming. The Gruber family lived there. Andreas, the patriarch, a man who commanded fear more than respect, known to be rigid, reclusive, and, as it would later, be discovered, possibly much darker than anyone could have imagined. Next to him, his wife, Cecilia, quiet, almost erased. Many say that she already looked like a ghost in life, perhaps because of the weight of the years, or perhaps because of the weight of secrets he carried. They had a daughter, Victoria, young, widowed, and mother of 2 young children. A woman who, despite living surrounded by horror, still went to church, sang in the choir, and smiled at the neighbors. But that smile hid deep pain, and stories that the whole village murmured, but no one had the courage to face head-on. Little Cecilia, his daughter, bore the same name as her grandmother, a lively, curious child, and Yosef, the youngest, a baby of only 2 years old. His paternity? It was a shadow over the family. Some said it was the result of a new relationship. They preferred not to comment, because there was something very wrong in the dynamics of that house. Something that went beyond small-town gossip. And then we have the maids, Crescens R., who lived there for almost a year before resigning in a hurry. She told close friends that she felt presences in the attic, that he heard footsteps when everyone was already asleep, that something knocked on her bedroom door during the night, and that more than once he woke up with the feeling that someone or something. I watched her from the dark. When she had a child of her own, Crescens decided to leave. She didn't want that presence, whatever it was, to touch her baby. Shortly after, another maid was hired, Maria Baumgartner, young, lonely, and willing to work. She arrived at the farm on March 31st, 1922. She was welcomed with a simple dinner, normal conversations, and then he disappeared along with everyone else that night. Your first day on the job, it was also the last. Now, pay attention to this. Weeks before the crime, the tension began to grow. The family commented among themselves, and eventually with close neighbors, about noises in the attic, like steps, furniture dragging, heavy, muffled breathing as if someone slept above them. But the attic had no beds, nor resident. It was just a forgotten space, where dust, straw, and maybe something that should never have been awakened. Andreas even searched with a flashlight and a shotgun, but he never found anything, except perhaps more questions. Because soon after that, a key disappeared, the key to the main door. And even with the house locked at night, things changed places in the morning. Objects disappear, windows open by themselves. An unknown newspaper, coming from a distant city, appears on the table. No neighbor received that newspaper. The postman never delivered it. So how did he get there? Footprints were found in the snow, coming from the forest towards the house, but no footprint back, just a line of steps, as if someone had walked to the door of the farm and simply disappeared, or stayed, remained, watching. It was as if a presence was settling there little by little, taking up space, studying the routine, knowing every noise, every room, every soul. You start to feel that something is wrong when even animals act differently. The dogs barked into the void. The cattle, restless, refused to enter the stable at night. The atmosphere around the property felt heavy, as if the air itself was charged. And yet, life went on, or at least, he tried. Victoria, despite everything, maintained her routine. I went to church, participated in the choir, took care of the children, but in his eyes, there was something that never went away. Fear, and maybe resignation, as if she knew there was no way out, as if she knew it was too late. The last time she was seen in the city, Victoria commented to a friend that the house seemed alive, that he heard things, that he felt things, and for a moment he was silent, before saying, "If something happens to us, it wasn't an accident." Words like these do not come for nothing, even more so when they are the last one says. And this is where we begin to understand that this is not just a murder. It is a macabre ritual that unfolded slowly, a kind of terror that is not announced with screams, but with whispers, with details so small that they seem insignificant, until it's too late. Because evil, the real evil, it doesn't make noise. He settles in, he observes, he waits, and that night he finally acted. At first, it all seemed to be just a sequence of coincidences. But when we look back, with the lens of the tragedy already consummated, every detail turns into something sinister, something that gives you goosebumps, something that screams for attention, even if at the time it was ignored. It was late March 1922, the trees still without leaves, the biting winds blowing through the forest, and the feeling that something invisible was hovering around the property, as if a storm was brewing, but not in heaven, inside the house, in the very air they breathed. Andreas Gruber leaves early to check the farm's engine, located in an annex away from the barn, and there, he sees something that makes him immobile. The engine door, locked, heavy, made of sturdy wood, was broken into, as if someone had forced their way in, but there was no sign of theft. Nothing had been taken. The engine was still there, intact, only silence, and the dense air that made even the sound of his own footsteps seem louder than it should be. And then he sees the footprints, imprinted in the thick snow. They come from the forest, cut through the field, pass directly by the side of the house, and stop right in front of the broken door. But they don't come back. There is no continuation, no way back, no detour. It was as if whoever had left those marks had simply disappeared, or worse, he had entered. Anyone's instinct would be to call the police, but Andreas doesn't. Perhaps out of pride. Maybe because deep down, he knew that what he was facing was not something that a policeman with a notebook and a revolver would solve. Or perhaps he hid something that prevented him from opening the gates to the authorities. Whatever the reason, he decided to deal with it himself. And this was possibly the first irreversible mistake. That same week, Victoria, her daughter, remarked to a woman in the village that at night she heard someone walking in the attic, slow steps, dragged, as if the wood was being pressed by something heavy. Andreas, upon hearing his daughter's account, did what any protective father would do. He took his flashlight, loaded his shotgun, and went upstairs to investigate. But up there, he found nothing. No person, no animals, no sign of invasion, just dust, planks, and that silence, that uncomfortable silence, that kind of silence you hear when you're being watched, the kind of silence that makes your heart beat in your ear. But there, it was real. The next day, something even stranger. A newspaper appeared in Mari, the kitchen, a Munich newspaper, a city many miles away. No one in the village subscribed to that newspaper. Not even the postman who made the deliveries could explain how it got there. Victoria, when questioned, replied, "It wasn't us. He just showed up." And it would echo for a long time. You might even think that all of this is just exaggeration, that maybe it was paranoia, rural fear, superstitions of a time without technology. But then a detail comes into play that changes everything. The testimony of the family's former maid, Crescence. She had quit her job months earlier. He fled, in fact. He did not formally resign. She left in the middle of the night with her newborn son in her arms and never wanted to return. During a conversation with a local merchant, Crescence confided that during the nights, something moved the handle of his room, that he heard murmurs in the hallway when everyone was already asleep, who once woke up with hot breathing on his face. But the room was empty. Who, in the last weeks before his departure, always woke up at the same time, 3:33 in the morning, always, without fail, as if it were being awakened for something. "It was like the house wanted me out of there," she said, and who are we to doubt it? Most of the villagers believed it was just another distant family, living on the edge of the forest, but there were those who said the opposite, people who refused to pass on the road at night, who changed sidewalks when she saw Victoria with the baby in her arms, people who spoke softly when the name Gruber was mentioned, not out of respect, but out of fear. And now, adding it all up, the newspaper, the footprints, the noises in the attic, the key lost days before, the strange behavior of the animals, the broken door, and the dense silence. Would you still call it all a coincidence? It is as if the house itself is being prepared, as if she were becoming something more. Not just a place to live, but a setting, stage, for something monstrous, to something impossible to understand. It is in this type of story that unsolved mysteries become legends. But Hinterkaifeck is not a legend. It's not folklore. It is a real crime, with real bodies, with real blood, and with a horror that no one has ever been able to explain, because maybe have no explanation. And now that you know that someone or something was inside the house, the question that doesn't want to be silent is, why? What exactly was this presence waiting for? What did she observe night after night? And why did he only act on that specific night? The truth is, every little detail, even that misplaced newspaper, that missing key, that subtle sound coming from the attic, was part of something bigger, something calculated, something cold. And it is exactly here that our story begins to plunge into a point of no return. By the way, if you've heard of the Hinterkaifeck case before, comment below what shocked you the most so far. Was it the newspaper that appeared out of nowhere, the lost key, or the footsteps coming from the attic? Right there. I heard the footsteps too, just so I know that you are with me so far. And if you're thinking that this all sounds like an absurd sequence of ignored signals, you haven't seen anything yet. Over the next few days, something began to feel wrong, but not wrong enough to sound alarming, at least not immediately. After all, it was an isolated farm. Sometimes families would disappear for a day or two to settle matters in neighboring villages. Sometimes they were simply held incommunicado because of the weather, the snow, or the heavy routine of the camp. But this silence, it was different. On Monday, the teacher of Cecilia, the 7-year-old girl, noticed the student's absence. The child was known to have fragile health, so no one was that surprised on the first day. But when she didn't show up on Tuesday either, and on Wednesday, the malaise began to grow. In small villages, where everyone knows everyone, the sudden disappearance of an entire family is like a stone thrown into a calm lake. The waves spread fast, and they bothered deeply. In the same week, the milkman who made deliveries to the property said he was surprised by something very specific. The milk left there at the gate on Monday was still in the same place on Wednesday, untouched. No loose animals, no children running around the yard, no response when knocking on the door. The normally noisy dog was tied up quietly, staring into the void, as if waiting for something that would never come again. And then came the most disturbing account of that week. A man in the area, who was walking at night toward the nearby village, reported seeing smoke coming out of the farm's chimney. That alone would not be alarming. It was cold. But the detail he described is what gives us goosebumps to this day. According to him, as he approached the property, he saw a man standing there holding a lit lantern in the middle of nowhere, looking at him. The light of the lantern blinded him momentarily, and for an instant he could only see the silhouette of this stranger standing between the darkness of the forest and the fire of the house. He looked away. He quickened his pace, and he never went back down that path. If hell had an address, maybe it would be there. On April 4th, finally, someone decided to act. A repairman named Albert Hoffner had been called days earlier to fix the farm's engine. Arriving there, around 9 in the morning, he found everything silent. No family members showed up to greet him. The front door was locked. The only sound was that of the wind crossing the field and the sporadic barking of the dog tied to the entrance. The animal looked agitated, as if it knew something was wrong, but it also looked tired, as if he were watching for days, as if he had been left there to store something. Not knowing what to do, Hoffner waited for a while. He knocked on doors, called, but there was no one. With no options and an agenda to fulfill, he forced the door of the shed where the engine was and carried out the repair himself. He stayed there for almost 5 hours. Afterwards, he stopped by the house of the neighboring family, the Schlittenbauers, and said that no one was on the farm. He asked them to notify as soon as the family returned, but they would not return. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a close neighbor and central figure in this story, and someone who would later also be a suspect, decided to go to the property along with 2 young men from the village. What they found cannot be described lightly. First, they tried to enter through the main door. Locked. They turned around and went to the barn, where they noticed something strange. Hay piled on a part of the floor in an unusual way, as if someone was hiding something. And they were. As they moved the hay, they found the first body, Victoria Gabriel, lying on her stomach, disfigured face. Next to her, the body of her father, Andreas. Then, his mother, Cecilia, the grandmother. And finally, little Cecilia, the granddaughter, lying with her eyes still open. His face showed not only the impact of violence, but the terror of having seen it all. The 4 were arranged in a line, one over the other, as if they had been dragged there, as if someone had gone back and arranged their bodies like pieces on a macabre board. There was no blood on the walls. There were no signs of a struggle, only hay, bodies, and an absolutely disconcerting calm. That post-violence tranquility, that seems to scream. While Lorenz ran into the house looking for Joseph, the other 2 men remained frozen. It was as if time had stopped. When they finally opened the back door and entered the residence, what they saw only confirmed the nightmare. Joseph, the baby, was found dead in his crib, covered with a blanket, as if the killer had sensed pity, or just didn't want to look into the eyes of the child he had just killed. In the room of the newly arrived maid, Maria, another body, rigid, lying next to the bed, still in shoes, still with his suitcases by his side, as if she hadn't even had time to settle in. First night of work, last night of life. Now, watch. This is the darkest point in the whole story. Not only the bodies were there, but there were clear signs that someone remained in the house after the murders. Food was consumed, the fireplace was lit, the kitchen calendar had been turned to the next day. The milk had been expressed, and the most disturbing, the hay bed in the attic. It showed signs that someone had slept there. Yes, the killer did not flee. He stayed. He slept between the mortos. Commute.sa warmed up, and he waited, as if the house no longer belonged to the family, but of him, as if it were all part of a ritual, a macabre theater in which the murderer was also the only spectator, and the only survivor. This type of behavior, staying at the scene of the crime, manipulating space, interacting with bodies, is not common, nor in serial killers, nor in criminals motivated by theft. Right? It's something different. This is pathological, this is ritualistic, this borders on the supernatural. Because who could live with the corpses for days, with that smell, that presence, that weight, unless that didn't bother him, unless he was already at home. And now that you know all this, I need to ask you, Who do you think was there? Who do you think had the, cold blood, or maybe no real blood, to lie down between 6 butchered bodies and just wait? And if you think that's already the worst this story can offer, wait until you find out how the investigation was conducted, or rather, how it was destroyed. If the brutality of the murders was already something out of the ordinary, what came after only deepened the abyss of this mystery, turning a terrible massacre into one of the greatest investigative failures in European criminal history. And this is where the Hinterkaifeck case is no longer just a crime. It becomes a double tragedy, by violence and by oblivion, because what began with blood ended in ashes, confusion, and silence. The local police, who at that time were officers without any technical training, arrived at the farm too late. But the worst thing was not the delay. That's what they found when they arrived. Or rather, what was already there. Neighbors, curious, people who invaded the property as soon as the first. Bodies were discovered. People coming and going, walking on the tracks of the killer, moving objects, opening doors, closing windows, touching the victims. Some, it is believed, even took souvenirs from the place, as if it were a spectacle and not the scene of a crime. And how can we blame these people entirely when the police themselves allowed everything to continue? During the first 48 hours of the investigation, no perimeter was established, no area was isolated, no reliable photographic record has been made. Fingerprints were compromised, footprints in the snow, completely erased, and any trace of logic in the place was buried under ignorance and neglect. But the absurdity did not stop there. In the absence of an adequate medico-legal institute, the autopsy was carried out right there, in the barn, exactly where the bodies were. A coroner improvised a board over 2 barrels and began examining the corpses in the hay, surrounded by neighbors watching as if it were a fairground. Spectacle. It was a medieval scenario in the middle of the 20th century. And even worse, the bodies, already in an advanced state of decomposition, were handled without any protective equipment. The information obtained? Partial, incomplete, contradictory. And then, as if reality wasn't already macabre enough, an even more surreal decision was made. The heads of the victims were cut off and sent to a medium. Yes, you heard that right. Not for forensic analysis, but for a seer, a sensitive, an expert in communication with the dead. The absurd hope was that he could, in some supernatural way, receive a message from beyond with clues about the killer. The police bet more on mediumship than on science, more in superstition than in logic. And these heads, transported to a nearby town, never returned. Years later, during the bombings of World War II, all the remains that were stored in the police station, including the decapitated heads, were destroyed, lost forever. Today, not even the skulls of the victims exist anymore. It's as if someone is trying to erase every piece of evidence, one by one. And now, think with me. Why would the killer have turned the kitchen calendar to the next day? Why prepare a meal after killing 6 people? Why light the fireplace? Who cares about the cold after committing a massacre? The answer is what bothers us most. He cared. He wanted comfort. He didn't run away in panic. He settled down, as if all that were part of an acceptable daily life, as if the horror had not been enough to drive him out. And perhaps because it was not the first time, another disturbing detail. Even after the police arrived, some things kept changing inside the house. A clock that had mysteriously stopped started working again. One of the lockers was found locked from the inside, as if someone was still hiding. There was cutlery out of place, family clothes thrown in positions different from those described in the previous days. It was as if the killer was still there, observing everything, hidden between the walls or in some secret compartment that was never discovered. To this day, there are those who believe that someone may have remained on the farm while the investigation took place, sleeping in the attic, going down the stairs at night, going through the cracks, watching one's tracks being destroyed by incompetent hands. It is the most literal embodiment of the concept of the monster inside the house. Police reports from the time are a festival of contradictions. An officer said that the back door was locked. Another said that she was just leaning against her. One of them stated that there was blood in the maid's room. Another said no. And worse, some of these notes seem to have been altered days later, as if someone were trying to rearrange the facts to fit a specific narrative. And the most revolting thing is that no concrete clues were collected, no fingerprints were analyzed, no tool of expertise, no matter how rudimentary, was applied correctly. The result? A massacre that began with extreme brutality ended with complete impunity. Imagine the pain of an entire community that saw its neighbors, its friends, its children being murdered. And that, even so, she was forced to swallow silence as the only answer. No one to blame, no judgment, no name revealed, only suspicions, and the echo of footsteps that may never have left that house. And perhaps the most disturbing of all is to realize that even with all the incompetence of the investigation, there were clear signs of something deeper, something that escaped the comprehension of the time, a darkness that could not be contained with flashlights and guns. Because this was not just a massacre, it was the manifestation of something that had been brewing within those walls for a long time, something that, when it finally revealed itself, did so with such fury. And then he stayed there, watching. That is why, to this day, the Hinterkaifeck case remains an open wound in German history. Because it wasn't just the family that was buried on that farm, it was also the truth. By the way, tell me in the comments, do you think the police really wanted to solve this crime? Or was someone interested in hiding what really happened? Right, they knew, if you also think this investigation was sabotaged from the start. And now, with all this mess in place, with the evidence destroyed and the questions unanswered, let's dive into the next point, the theories. The assumptions that try, to this day, to sew this nightmare with some logic. But get ready, because some of these hypotheses are more frightening than the crime itself. When a tragedy defies any rational explanation, theories gain ground. And in the Hinterkaifeck case, the silence of the police was an invitation for the people, and decades later, the scholars, to fill in the gaps with something even more frightening, possibilities. And when these possibilities involve revenge, incest, insanity, and even the hypothesis of an international serial killer, what remains is not just doubt. It is terror in its purest state. Let's start with the most talked about theory among conspiracists, the one that seems to come out of a Stephen King book, but which, amazingly, has already been taken seriously by real investigators. The idea that the murders in Hinterkaifeck were the work of an itinerant serial killer, a silent predator who crossed borders as if crossing curtains. And we're not talking about just any name. One of the main candidates would be Paul Muller, suspected of dozens of deaths in American and European territory, known for mysteriously disappearing, always after brutal massacres in rural areas. Paul acted in the dark, always on remote farms, always with an impact weapon, always killing entire families. And most disturbingly, according to the book The Man from the Train by Bill James, his victims were often found covered with pillows, blankets, or hay, just like the Grubers. But if Muller really crossed the ocean and killed on German soil, why Hinterkaifeck? Why precisely that house? Why stay there for days? And it is at this point that the serial killer theory begins to crumble. Because there are too many signs that the killer knew the family's routine well. He knew where the keys were. He knew how to move around the house without being noticed. He knew how to calm the dog. He knew where the food was, and he used the stove as if it were his own. Serial killers don't usually cook at the crime scene, much less sleep there. Not for several days. This is not serial killer standard. Right, it's personal. So let's move on to the darkest and most intimate theory of all. What if the killer didn't it come from outside? What if he was already inside the house before the murders? Or worse, what if he was part of his own family? The first name that comes up in this case is Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, officially killed in World War I, buried, forgotten. But did he really die? Or would he have come back from the hell of war to find his wife with another man, and a child that might not have been his? This theory, which mixes jealousy, honor, and hatred, states that Carl may have been presumed dead in battle, but he actually survived, lived in the shadows, and returned to Hinterkaifeck with a thirst for revenge. He would have discovered the rumors of incest between Andreas and Victoria. He would have seen little Joseph and felt that something was wrong, and then, seized by a blind fury, he would have committed the massacre. As punishment, as purgation. It may seem unlikely, but think with me. Traumatized soldiers were common back then. Many returned changed, cold cuts, silent, and yes, there are unconfirmed reports of a Russian commander, years later, confessing to German prisoners that he committed the Hinterkaifeck murders, and that his name was Carl Gabriel. But that's where the theory falls apart, because Carl's body was identified by fellow fighters, because there is no real trace of him after the war, and because no physical clue has ever linked his name to the massacre. What is left are only shadows, stories, rumors, and perhaps in the end, that's what this case offers the most: noises in the dark. The next theory, however, is much more concrete. much closer, much more possible. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor, the father, the man who arrived first at the scene of the crime, the man who opened the locked door with a key, who had disappeared days before, the man who walked straight to the barn as if he knew exactly where the bodies were, the same one who, during the investigation, was extremely interested in the details, who controlled who entered, who left, who spoke, the same one who, years later, would make strange comments in public, saying, for example, that the killers just walked backwards in the tracks to mislead, a phrase that seemed more like a slip than a theory. Lorenz was a man torn between guilt and scandal. He had an unresolved relationship with Victoria. He claimed to be Joseph's father, but he refused to pay alimony. He had previously denounced Andreas for incest, and at the time of the crime, his reputation was in ruins. He had lost his wife, he raised children alone, and he was still pointed out as the man who slept with the woman who had a child from his own father. All this in a village where secrets were impossible to hide. If there was a man with emotional motivation, access to property, familiarity with the place, and enough strength to commit the crime, it was him. But why then wasn't Lorenz arrested? Why was there no formal charge? Simple: lack of evidence. Once again, the chaos of the crime scene prevented any conclusion, and the lack of expertise left everything under the veil of doubt. But what if neither Carl nor Lorenz were the real culprits? What if the killer was someone who also died that night? Yes, there is a frightening theory, and, for many, the most logical of all, that Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was the one who started it all. He had already been convicted of incest. He was feared by his daughter. He was despised by his neighbors. He had a reputation for being controlling, violent, and paranoid. In the days leading up to the murders, Victoria confided that she was afraid. He said he couldn't take it anymore, that maybe he would run away. Andreas didn't want to lose control, and perhaps in a fit of rage he killed them all. But then the inevitable doubt arises. If Andreas was the murderer, who killed him? Could it be possible that, after killing his daughter, wife, grandchildren, and maid, Andreas committed suicide? But there is no indication of this. His body was found with signs of struggle, a deep blow to the face, as if he had been surprised. Was it Lorenz? Would he be an accomplice? Or would Andreas have been killed by someone, that he also wanted justice? Perhaps at this point in history, the most important thing is not to know who killed, but why. Because Hinterkaifeck's crimes seem to have been motivated by more than hatred, more than revenge. They have marks of punishment, of purgation, of someone who wanted to erase that lineage completely, as if the house itself was cursed, as if someone, or some strength, had decided to put an end to it all. And now I want to hear from you. Which of these theories makes the most sense to you? Was Carl the vengeful husband? Was it Lorenz, the rejected lover? Or was it Andreas himself, the monster behind the door? Here's the final theory, the one we're going to explore now. It's more disturbing than any of those. What if the answer to all this? Has it always been in our faces? What if the most plausible and darkest theory is precisely the one that almost no one wants to accept? Because sometimes, the truth is not buried with the victims. She is buried with the killer. And in this case, perhaps the killer was one of them. A member of one's own family, the pillar of the house, the patriarch. What if Andreas Gruber, the same man who led the farm, who imposed fear among the neighbors and absolute control over his own, was also the one who killed them all? Think with me. It was Andreas who had the key to the house that mysteriously disappeared days before the massacre. It was he who, instead of seeking help from the police, after noticing strange footprints in the snow and hearing noises in the attic, preferred to deal with everything himself. He was the one who said that everything was under control. But what kind of man sleeps peacefully after learning that maybe someone is hiding in his attic? What kind of father is silent after his daughter reports hearing footsteps above the ceiling? What kind of grandfather ignores his granddaughter's tears of fear? Perhaps the kind of man who wasn't afraid, because he already knew exactly what was happening. Maybe the person in the attic wasn't an intruder. Maybe there was never anyone in the attic, because Andreas was the monster himself. The noise came from him. The surveillance was his. And the plan, silently drawn up over weeks, was his too. The murder weapon, a handmade medicine, similar to an axe, was found just a year later, hidden in the ceiling of the barn, a place of limited access. The same tool that Andreas used to use in the field. It was his. He knew where to hide. He knew how to do the most damage with the least amount of noise. And all the bodies were killed with well-aimed blows, repeated, stuck with fury. It was not execution. It was punishment. But why? This is the question that haunts every corner of this story. Why would Andreas kill his own wife, his daughter, his grandchildren, and even a maid who had just arrived? The answer may lie in a word that has been with us since the beginning of this video: power. Andreas was obsessed with control. His relationship with Victoria was more than unhealthy. He had been arrested for incest years earlier. He was known in the village as someone who would not let his daughter marry. He even boycotted her relationship with Lorenz Schlittenbauer, that same neighbor who, ironically, would become a key player in this story. Victoria, in the months leading up to the massacre, began to change. He made bank withdrawals. He hid money. He left a significant amount. In the church, perhaps as spiritual protection. He confided to colleagues that he intended to escape, take the children, and leave that damn house. But for Andreas, this meant only one thing: the end of his personal empire, the breach of his authority. The daughter was not just blood, it was property. And when a property threatens to escape, the man who thinks he owns the world does the unthinkable. He did not kill on impulse. He killed for dominance. And that was why each member of the family was individually drawn to the barn, one by one, quietly, maybe with excuses, maybe with orders. First the granddaughter, perhaps curious, then the daughter, then his wife, and then the baby and the maid, like pieces falling into a ritual that he believed was necessary: purification, punishment, silence. But here comes the cruelest detail, and perhaps the final piece of this macabre puzzle. If Andreas killed everyone, who killed Andreas? His body was found with the others, yes, but there was something strange. He seemed to have taken a single blow, more precise, different from the others. And here comes a twist that few consider. What if, in the end, Andreas Gruber didn't get away with it? And if anyone realized what was happening and acted? What if Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor, the supposed father of Joseph, the man who lost the chance to start a new family with Victoria, was the one who broke the cycle? Imagine this scene. Lorenz arrives at the house after days of silence. He smells the smoke, sees the dog tied up, feels that something is wrong. Enter the barn. He sees the bodies. He sees Victoria, the woman he wanted to protect, dead. The baby, perhaps her son, murdered. And there, in the corner, Andreas. Maybe I do. Perhaps staggering. Perhaps in shock. And then, Lorenz ages. Take the same doctor. He strikes Andreas hard. Kill the man who destroyed his last chance at happiness. But he does not call the police immediately. He needs to look innocent. He needs a story. Then he moves the bodies. He stages the discovery. It becomes the good neighbor, the collaborator, the interested party, the one who takes care of the crime scene, the one who explains the details. But inside, he knows. He killed for justice, or for revenge, or out of pure hatred. And that would explain why so many clues point to him, but no proof. He did not commit the massacre, but it has come full circle. Maybe Andreas killed them all, and Lorenz killed Andreas. This hypothesis, even without physical evidence, is the only one that ties all the dots together. The intimate knowledge of the routine of the house, Andreas's gun being used in the crimes, the calendar turned the next day, the food consumed calmly, the absence of escape, the staging of discovery made by Lorenz. This explains the theater. It explains the chaos. It explains why no one runs away. Because evil, he was inside the house the whole time. And when he finally bled, no one had the courage to tell the truth. And this is where you come in. Yes, you who are watching this so far, what do you believe? Was Andreas the cruel killer who destroyed his own family? Or was Lorenz more than a curious neighbor? Was he the enforcer of justice that the police never dared to touch? Because there's still one last piece to go. And when it is fitted, you may never look at an isolated house the same way again. We will never know for sure what happened in that house. We can dig through the archives, question the testimonies, distrust the authorities, draw unlikely connections, but no theory, no matter how detailed or convincing, will erase the central fact. 6 lives were brutally interrupted, and what remained, apart from the silence, was a dense fog of doubt and horror that never dissipated. Victoria Gabriel, her daughter Cecilia, only 7 years old, little Joseph, only 2, the elderly mother, the new maid, and yes, even Andreas Gruber, all ended up in the same fate. A barn covered in hay, a senseless massacre, a crime that left invisible marks on the walls of the house, in the surrounding fields, and above all, in the soul of those who knew this story. The deepest pain is knowing that the innocent paid with their lives for secrets they did not choose to carry. Cecilia and Joseph were just children. They didn't know what the adults were hiding. They had no way of understanding what was taking place in the silent nights of that farm. What did they see? What did they hear? What did they feel before they closed their eyes for the last time? Questions that echo like whispers in the dark, and that haunt us, even more than a century later. And Victoria. Victoria was a woman imprisoned by an unhealthy family system, in a cruel time with women, and surrounded by men who only knew how to possess her, never protect her. Daughter of an abusive father, mother of a child born under suspicion, rejected by a lover who refused to assume paternity, and judged by an entire village. She died without justice. But if this video serves anything, let it be to remember that it existed, that she tried to resist, that he may have planned to run away, and that she was silenced for that. Hinterkaifeck's greatest lesson is a wound that still pulsates in modern times. Because history teaches us a truth that no one likes to face. Evil does not have to come from the forest. He may be in the next room, in the kitchen chair, on the same plate as supper, sleeping under the same roof. He can nigh, wear the face of a father, from a husband, from a neighbor. The evil, sometimes, it's from home. And maybe that's why this story never left our heads. Because it forces us to look inside. Because it shows us that behind the locked door of any home, there may be something too dark to be understood. And that, sometimes, what we most want to ignore, it is what we need to see the most. If you've come this far, it's because you haven't run away from the truth. You faced every detail, every mental image, every name that was buried along with the silence of that farm. So, prove to me that you are here with me until the end. He writes in the comments now, evil lives within. Simple as that. Is that it? If I see that sentence, I'll know that you went until the last second, that you felt the weight of this story with me, and maybe that you're like me, someone who needs to understand the inexplicable. And if you felt that this story moved you in any way, don't keep it just for yourself. Leave a like now. This gesture makes YouTube deliver this video to more people who, like you, like true horror stories, unsolved mysteries, supernatural crimes. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, this is the time. Here, we don't just tell stories, we relive echoes, we dig up hidden truths, and we share that uncomfortable feeling that, deep down, something is not right. Click sign up, activates the bell. Because in the next video, the darkness is going to be even denser. And speaking of the next video, it's already there on the screen. Yes, that one. Click now. Because the story that follows perhaps has an even stranger ending. Or maybe it didn't even have an ending.